is this? I don't know. It's me. It's Amid the Ruins. It's a guy who makes dire wave music. It's Amid the Ruins. Dire wave music.
What I've talked about in, probably 100 articles at JaysAnalysis is the implementation of the AI smart grid and the giant smart cities, which is what IBM talks about publicly building. And that's where we're going, and that's what I think we have to be really concerned about. So all of these tensions, they are part of a long-term strategy to basically get everybody moved into megacities. They'll be forced off of land and so forth for environmental reasons, and basically concocted and invented environmental nonsense. Then you'll be stuck in some hellhole megacity in a, basically a carton-sized apartment living over a Target or something, or inside of a Target or a Walmart, as I said several years ago. It's actually coming true now. There's actually Target cities. This is all part of the long-term globalist strategy. So, but to get there, you've got to have the constant clash, the constant alchemical blending and mixing and smashing together right out of Manichaeanism to produce the convergence, to produce the synthesis. And that's what's crucial in all this, and what is absolutely true from an alchemical, esoteric, philosophical, and geopolitical perspective, the fact the ruling elite seek to be post-human. JaysAnalysis.com. fix today's problems politically. And this is what so many people in alt circles and alt-right and alt-whatever and alt-media, they all seem to think that there's like a political solution to man's problems. And really the whole of modernity is built on this neo-pagan concept of political salvation. And there is no political salvation for man, because man's problems are not essentially political, they're spiritual. The hierarchy of how man views himself in the world has been inverted. I've covered over and over and over the white papers that actually discussed how to invert and subvert that, changing images of man, things
All right,
like this.
welcome.
So what has to happen is that
we back to that high IQ stuff now. It's time to get back to that high IQ stuff. Welcome. Yes, I have to have a piece of ginger in my mouth. I don't care, Boomer, if you don't like it. Every time I have a piece of gum or ginger, a Boomer says, disgusting. Do you not eat food? Do you not chew gum? Are you a Gnostic being? Are you the form of human? You don't actually engage in the normal human activities of chewing gum and eating disgusting foods? Well, maybe one day we will ascend into the Gnostic stratosphere like you. But I need sugar and candy for my beatus. And if you can't handle that, then don't let the door hit you on however that goes. Don't let your ass hit your face on the way the door or whatever that is. Welcome. Yeah, I went to a Boomer. I don't mean to just be talking about boomers, but it was a Boomer haircut place. And if you go to an old man barber, like a legit barber with the peppermint candy cane out front, you get the same haircut. Like, you could pick from all these styles, and that dude don't give a damn. You're gonna get the same haircut. You're gonna get the military Marine Corps cadet haircut. Even if you told that dude, I want a spiky mullet like Theo Vaughn, you're gonna get Marine Corps, and he's gonna turn you around and spin you around and say, there you go, I gave you what you wanted. That's literally what happened. I told that dude I want a one on the sides and a straight up. When that goes into that Boomer's ears, which he don't think he could hear, he just heard, give him the military cut, because that's the only haircut you get at the peppermint candy stick Boomer barbershop, baby. I'm gonna swallow this so people don't bitch. All right, we're going full whiteboard today, y'all. It's gonna be heavy. It's gonna be hot and heavy in a sapiosexual way. Now, the book that we're going to be loosely looking at as kind of a rough outline, I said for a long time I would get to this book. We're finally going to cover Dr. Feser Array, Dr. Laser Feser, 5 Proofs for the Existence of God. And he picks 5 philosophers: Aristotle, Plotinus, Augustine, Aquinas, Leibniz. Now, there's a lot of good places in this book, a lot of really good chapters. The majority of this we'll be covering in part 2 for the subscribers. For this public installment, we'll be covering chapter 3, the Augustinian Proof, because of course it's the closest that we get to transcendental argumentation in this book. There's a lot of good arguments in this chapter, a lot of the arguments that you've heard me use. So I was glad to see Feser using a lot of these arguments, because of course there's similarities with transcendental types of arguments in this chapter to the transcendental argument for God. But remember that the transcendental argument for God is not identical to all transcendental arguments. I can make a transcendental argument for the necessity of universals, the necessity of the self, right? That's not the same as the argument at a paradigm level for the necessity of the existence of God. There's a couple places where Feser comes pretty close, and he will make the divine conceptualism argument that you hear me make all the time, but we're going to supplement it with the real solid version, the tweaked version from St. Maximus. And Feser is not aware of Maximus. He doesn't know about the Logi doctrine. He doesn't know how the Logi doctrine is different from the exemplar doctrine of Aquinas and so forth. So we're going to point out where things go awry, but we're also going to point out the many, many good places. And then in part 2, we'll cover the other chapters on Aristotle, Aquinas, and Leibniz, and Plotinus, and there will be places in there as well. I mean, there's areas of Leibniz, as you've heard me talk about over the years, that are pretty insightful. Leibniz has some good arguments that come up in this chapter of the Augustinian Proof that we'll be referring to, and then we will look at a couple interesting points that I was reminded of in Basil. Someone a long time ago had heard me say in one of the talks, where do you get the argument that Aristotle believes in a great architect of the universe? And I could not remember exactly where the phrase was because, of course, as you can see, the works of Aristotle are very vast. And then I was looking back through Basil's Hexameron, and I found where Basil makes the argument. As you can see, what you hear me say is almost always just what the Eastern Fathers say. Like, I'm not coming up with this stuff out of my butt. It's not just made up. I'm just really just repeating stuff that I've imbibed from primarily Cappadocians when it comes to the Church Fathers. Obviously, the Cappadocians have the preeminence because the Cappadocians gave us the settled triadology, really. There's not a whole lot of development in triadology after the Cappadocians. There's development in the sense of explication when it comes to Christology after the Cappadocians. But this is, as we had in a pretty heated debate in the Discord the other night with a Roman Catholic, a Scotist, there's really not development. I mean, what you see John Damascus present is really a representation of what's in the Cappadocians. So for us, Athanasius and Cappadocians, that's pretty much it for the Trinity. The only other explication is Gregory of Cyprus and Palamos in relation to eternal manifestation at Blachernae and the Palamite synods. That's really it. But that's already in Basil and John Damascus, eternal manifestation. So there's really the impasse I'm constantly realizing when we are debating with Roman Catholics is Cappadocians, is the lack of familiarity with Cappadocians. And that's why a good place to start is the Szyszynski Filioque book, which we covered. We did a whole stream, 3-hour stream on that, because Szyszynski, who was Uniate at the time, essentially admits that there's no double procession hypostatic origin proof in the East in the first 7 centuries at all. There's not one proof. Augustine is really the only father that can be brought forth to support that position. But it doesn't really matter because the dogmatic theology of the Cappadocians is what's confirmed in the councils. Anyway, that's not what we're here to talk about tonight. We're going to talk about Feser. And we're going to go through the chapter on the Augustinian Proof because, once again, we're also going to see that when you hear me make tag, it's very similar to the arguments that we find Augustine making at times. Augustine presents a divine conceptualism argument. And, of course, we want to remind you that if you want to support and ask questions, we have philosophical questions. Feel free to ask those via Super Chat there to support the stream and the channel. And then in the next few days, I will make part 2 of this available for paid subscribers to JaysAnalysis, covering the rest of the Feser book. And then we're also going to look at a couple places in the Russian philosopher. Now, this is not a new argument in Andreev, but it's present in a very well-stated way in Andreev's little book, Orthodox Apologetic Theology. But it's also stated in Mystical Theology, and it's also stated in Lasky's Experience of God, Volume 1. And this is the argument that a bare monotheistic ADS entity is not a sufficient kind of deity or God because that God will necessitate a world to be God over. And therefore,
that's not our God, because the God that needs eternal matter, the God that needs an eternal world to be God over, for God to have meaning, for him to be a first cause of, Aristotle is more consistent because he says that leads to the view of eternal first heavens, eternal matter for him to form. And we'll see that Aristotle will make this argument in Book 12 of the Metaphysics. Basil will make fun of it, and so we will see that Basil supports the orthodox conception of apologetics and the fact that they don't mean the same thing by natural theology as the Thomists do. But let's get to Feser. I'm going to start with the Augustinian Proof. Before we do that, I want to remind you guys just of a little bit of the basics here, because we may have some people who are new to these ideas or topics, and they might find a little bit of this obtuse. But we're going to be looking at abstract entities today. Universals, concepts, numbers. You hear me invoke this argument all the time. And that's why I was delighted to finally get to this chapter, because this chapter pretty much makes all the arguments I make. There are arguments in Augustine, so nothing I'm saying is that out of the ordinary. We are taking the argument a little bit further and showing that it directly points to the triune God and not the generic theism God, which is essentially of no use to apologetics whatsoever. What's the point of doing apologetics if we're proving the same God as Islam, Scientology, Jehovah's Witnesses, right? That's a worthless first cause. That's not to say there's not a first cause. It's just saying it's not a good argument. And we will see that these kinds of arguments will be made here in Questions and Doubts. All right. Now remember that when we are looking at... Make sure you guys can hear me. Yeah. Welcome, everybody. Be sure to hit like. When we're looking at the notion of abstract objects, universals, numbers, concepts, propositions, laws of logic, we're looking at objects that are unlike the objects of our world. So we're going to remember Platonism here. We're going to use Platonism as kind of our exemplar to branch off from. So if we remember Plato's ideas of the forms, Plato thought that the realm of the forms was uniquely simple. It was uniquely one. It is summed up in the monad, right? That first primal unity. The forms are unchanging. The forms are impersonal in the sense that they're not like a human person. I know that Plato doesn't really have the conception of personhood as subject, as personal subject, the way that the Cappadocians will explain that. But regardless, it is important to mention that it's ideal, impersonal, immaterial, eternal. It's in stasis. This is very important because it's not in becoming. And then that's why Plato can point to things like, well, numbers are the best example of this kind of thing, right? So for Plato, they're in a third realm. They're not in our realm. They're in another higher realm. They're not in the mind per se. They're not in objects. So they must be in a third realm. Now, the important part is that when we look at this realm, it's usually characterized by the opposite, right? The realm that we inhabit. The realm that we inhabit is characterized by many. It's characterized by change. It's characterized by flux. It's characterized by being lesser in the chain of being according to how it relates to these things. So think about these things as higher on the spectrum, so to speak. The things that we experience are temporal. They come and go. And they participate thus in becoming. So the problem, as you can see pretty quickly, which actually Feser will mention, is that it doesn't really see how there's any relationship between these two disparate realms. Now for Plato, his solution... one solution he thinks kind of works is what he calls metexis, which is participation. The idea that the faint reflections of this world participate, quote unquote, in the forms. But of course, as you can begin to see, this doesn't really solve much. It's still problematic because if this realm is essentially one and the highest of this realm is pure unity, then it would seem to exclude the possibility of distinctions in this realm. How are the things of this realm distinct? Well, it's just ad hoc. Well, they just are, right? And as many of you guys know, what's the
solution that this is a great example of ad hoc rescue, which the idiot atheist the other night in the debate decided was not a fallacy. You could use them in debates, and so now you can use any informal fallacy in a debate because it's not a formal fallacy, as if formal and informal has anything to do with whether it's a non sequitur or not, right? They're all non sequiturs. It doesn't matter whether they don't follow, right? In the context of a debate. So when we think about that realm, we have that basic outline there from Plato. That's going to help us as we progress into this chapter from Feser, where we look into the pros and the cons. So we start by Feser mentioning the notion of universals, okay? The notion of particulars and of the general. So if we think of something general like catness, right? The idea of a cat, then when we look at a cat that we see on the mat, that is the particular, that's the instantiation of the common, the universal. For Plato, what's more real is not the physical instantiated cat in front of you. What's more real is the universal cat, right? Now, why do we speak of a universal cat or a universal idea? Well, Plato reasoned just pretty simply that obviously what makes a cat is not that it has 4 legs, hair, 2 eyes, because a cat could lose any of those properties, right? And it still is a cat, right? You know, tabby cat, Garfield's out there running around. He gets drunk, he gets coked up, and he falls underneath Tony Soprano's Range Rover. He gets his leg run over. He owes Tony Soprano money. He doesn't pay up. Garfield gets his eye poked out, right? He's still a cat. He doesn't lose catness because Tony Soprano took his eye and his leg, because of his fiendish habits. Thus, Plato argued, the essence of cat, the idea of cat, the form of cat, cannot be identified with any of the traits, nor merely just adding the traits up. There's something else, some higher order there that is that thing. Now remember, what's an essence? The essence is that which a thing must have to be that thing and no other thing. All right. Now, with that in mind, we can come to the notion of what universals are. So universals immediately relate to the problem of the one and the many. Plato has a whole dialogue. If you've listened to the lectures as we did throughout Plato's dialogues, you will know that, well, one and many comes up often. But I think it's in Phaedo. Phaedo seems to be occupied. Yes. And I will give you some sources for all you know-it-alls out there. So you can go find the sources for the one and the many and the universals in. I had it and then I just lost my page. Where'd it go? Just read the Phaedo, first of all, but here it is. Universals and participation comes up in Phaedo. 99, 100, 101. And then out throughout the Phaedo, you'll get discussions about one and many, particularity, universality, or the forms of things. Obviously, this shouldn't be controversial, but there's always somebody who wants to harass. So Feser goes on to say, when we look at things like roundness, redness, triangularity, etc., these are properties or features that cannot be identified with any single object, right? And obviously they have to have some reality, because if we deny that they have some reality, then we're going to run into a whole host of epistemic metaphysical problems. So abstract objects then cannot be identified or reducible to matter or the instantiations of matter. If you remember the debate with Stefan, I was just making this simple argument when I was pointing out that 7 coconuts is not the same thing as 7, obviously. Other arguments that philosophers invoke would be things like 2 + 2 = 4. Obviously, the proposition, the truth value of 2 + 2 = 4 is not identifiable to 2 rocks and 2 rocks. It's just pretty obvious that those two things are distinct. It doesn't take a whole lot of thinking power to realize that, but philosophers will also resort to things like possible worlds, right? So if you've been in the Discord, if you've heard a lot of the argumentation that Father Deacon Dr. Ananias has given on possible worlds and how philosophers utilize possible worlds to demonstrate which things are logically impossible, then you'll know that those are examples of things that refute materialism, because materialism can't really explain how, if everything is reducible to matter, there can be arguments that are sound and valid from logic that show the impossibility of the possible worlds being reducible to matter. And there's actually a paragraph where Feser covers that. But the first one in many argument is that universals like triangularity, redness are not reducible to any of the particulars, because anytime we talk about these things, it makes no sense to reduce the predicates that we're using to the instantiations. There must be some notion of triangularity that's not just identifiable with the secondary characteristics or features of the object in front of us. And he goes on to point out that when we look at geometry, you've heard me make this argument from Roger Penrose, comes up in the Mind of God book by Paul Davies. Mathematical principles are not invented, they're discovered. Okay, nobody invented or made up Mandelbrot sets, they were discovered. And the mathematicians who are honest, that spend their lives on these topics, will tell you that. They often speak this way, that they are discovering truths in the mental scape. They're not making them up, right? So this idiotic, atheistic, materialistic, reductionist argument that we just make up numbers, we just make up Pythagorean theorem, they're just made up, right? As if it would work consistently over time and across cultures if they were just made up. It's ludicrous. So Feser covers that and shows that those are examples of principles that are universal. So he lists things like numbers, universal concepts, universal propositions, laws of logic, possible worlds. These are all examples of things that are utilized that are not obviously not reducible to physical matter. Other concepts that are useful in mathematics, like zero and infinity, any of the pi, any of these things are obviously not identical to any specific thing under a microscope or any collection of molecules. He goes on to also point out the argument you've heard me make many times. This is from the Philosophy of Science. Husserl makes this argument. Science assumes the laws of logic and universals. If you heard the debate with Infidel Pharaoh that I had about a year ago, that was the summation of that whole debate. The whole debate was whether science is utilizing principles and laws for its argumentation and scientific process that are not immediately under the purview of empirical investigation. Obviously it does. So then he goes on to mention the argument from the nature of possible worlds. This is the argument that Father Deacon Ananias makes, similar to it, that you can conceive of a possible world that is not reducible to matter. The laws of logic still hold. Therefore, how could you conceive of these things if all this argumentation is reducible to matter? Right? So it's just a simple way to disprove the reducibility of logic in the realm of possible worlds to matter. Then he goes on to talk about, Feser does, about indirect argumentation. So then he goes on to say that this is the types of argument that you hear us make often as presuppositionalists, where we talk about the self-detonating nature, you could say, to quote Stefan here. The impossibility of the contrary, in the sense that when you deny universals, you put yourself in a host of problems. One of those would be the immediate claim against what's called realism. So if we're affirming an ontological reality or status, metaphysical status, to universals in some way, then we would be called a realist. Okay, there's not everybody has the same notion of realism. If you listen to last night's lecture, we talked about John Wycliffe, who was a ultra realist. He had basically a Platonic type of view. So not everybody has the same notion of realism, but just at the level of the debate here, we're just talking about whether we believe that universal concepts and universals have a real existence, or whether they are reducible to matter, or whether they, as he lists a different position, have only a conceptual reality. And we're going to see the problem with that as well, as it falls into solipsism, becomes useless. So, but he argues that if you can think of a possible world where it's at least possible for the universals to exist, then it shows that universals are not dependent on a human mind for their existence. And so the mere possibility of them shows that they are not reducible to matter. So those are a lot of different types of arguments he gets for realism. And then he moves on to point out that if we think of general names, like redness, red, etc., if you were to deny those and be a nominalist, nominalists are those who deny the reality of universal predicates or universals, then it's kind of difficult to explain what are we predicating that's in common. And the most common response from the nominalists is that, well, what we're predicating is that they just have a similarity between them. Well, that begs the question, what is it that resembles the other thing? What is it that is the similarity? Right? That's the very question that we're asked. You can't just say, well, they're similar, because that's assuming that there's a universal category that's not instantiated there. That's the point of what we're trying to argue here. And even Bertrand Russell, himself an atheist, noted the difficulty of this regress, that the resemblance argument that the nominalist often appeals to is itself a universal. Resemblance is a universal concept, and it would have to be the case for this argument to work, but then it's self-refuting. If a stop sign resembles a fire truck, since they're two different objects, then the thing that we call red has to be something more than just the instantiate, because the objects are obviously different. So to say that they share, quote, resemblance is to assume that resemblance is a real state of affairs that occurs across time and space, right? Because there's countless numbers of red objects in the world, and you're saying that the resemblance itself is consistent and adheres over time. It's invariant, right? Because redness doesn't turn into the opposite of itself in terms of the resemblance itself. And the nominalist just has to say that, well, we just don't know. Well, then the nominalist can resort to another level of moving the argument to say that, okay, well, I can avoid this dilemma by saying that we only call all of these examples resemblances merely because they resemble each other. They don't have an actual higher level existence. But this problem just moves the step to a higher level because Feser notes the various cases of resemblance resemble other various cases of resemblance. So now you just said, what is the resemblance of resemblance, you see? So this higher order moving up the problem is also itself relying on a universal concept. And so this, Bertrand Russell notes, would lead to an infinite regress. The next argument you've heard me make many times, which is the linguistic argument. Language, predication, assumes universal truth predicates, right? The tree is the tree is green. What else is green? The social justice hair is green. The ice pop is green. Right? So all three of those things are green. They're different things. And when we have a sentence that's meaningful, right, for communication, if we're actually communicating in a sentence, then greenness has to be something that is really meaningful and not reducible to the breath that's coming out of my mouth, not reducible to the gray matter in my head, not reducible to the molecules in the social justice greasy hair, or in the corn syrup popsicle, or in the tree leaves. So what are we predicating here? If it's something that's not real, it doesn't exist, greenness is not real. Yeah, you see, we begin to have these ridiculous problems that now we utilize and communicate with all these things that are not real. But remember, most of the time these are atheists who don't believe in made up things. But now all language itself is just made up and therefore meaningless. When I utter the word red, Socrates utters the word red. They are obviously particular, distinct instances and utterances of the same word. Yet this word exists over and over in our utterances and in the concepts in our mind, and yet they're different minds. So therefore there's something beyond the instantiations that allows for the conveying of meaning. Thus, words and language assume metaphysical realities. If you've been in the Discord the last week, I've probably made this argument at least 10 times with different people, different atheists bringing this up, and they don't get it. Some do. In general, it is a notoriously very difficult position to defend. Nominalism leads ultimately to the possibility of knowledge. That's not Feser saying that, that's me saying that. It's completely destructive to the possibility of language, meaning, knowledge, metaphysics, etc. And ultimately, when you move to the position that it's all just dependent upon a human mind, which we don't even have any to say that it depends on a human mind assumes the universal concept of mind that all minds possess. You can't even know that on this stupid position. It's a total collapse. It's totally stupid. It's really low IQ, low brain stuff. But every atheist pretty much believes this. Unless you're some weird variant of a Platonic atheist, they believe this nonsense. They can't even make sentences. That's my chief argument against the atheists. If you listen, I always say, you can't make a sentence. You'll say, but yeah, I just did. Right, so that proves that your worldview is not true. That's tag right there. The argument from the objectivity of concepts and knowledge. Any objective true statement, any claim, any concept itself, such as triangularity or redness, assume that the mind has the same idea, right? For us to meaningfully communicate about any object, anything, any proposition, any sentence, we can't reduce the meaning to the gray matter because I have different gray matter, right? So how do we if we reduce concepts to brain states, my brain states are not your brain states. Therefore, communication would be impossible if there was not something else higher than all of the physicalist instantiations. Feser goes on to make linguistic types of precondition arguments that you've heard me make 100 times. Consider also the many things that must be the case just for communication to be possible. This is the preconditions, transcendental argument about the possibility of communication. There's communication, and then there's a higher level of argument about what must be the case for communication to even be possible. Two different levels of argumentation. And he quotes Frege's essay, Thought. Right? So Frege has an essay, Thought, where he talks about the presuppositions of what must be the case for language to even be possible. Yes, exactly. Been here making that argument for years against atheism and materialism. Then he goes on to the argument, the reductio of the impossibility of psychologism. That's an easy one. You've heard me make this argument many times. One of which would be the naturalist fallacy that if all of our brain states are part of a determined chemical process, then they're not really you making choices. Your brain states are illusorily, it's an illusion that you are making choices and that you are coming to truths. You are merely a determined chemical process. So there's no you that stands behind these discoveries and these argumentations. Mind, logic, right? These things cannot be reducible to matter. He says it's necessary about our minds that we have concepts, standards of logic, etc., and they must be set forth, as we were saying, in order to have knowledge claims at all. to have the objective knowledge of nature of the workings of things, our minds must be situated in this way. He says, it goes on to say, to formulate and defend any claim, there must be an appeal to certain universal things like mind, right? If I'm going to make an argument about minds or about states of affairs from my mind, I'm assuming mind, I'm assuming self, I'm assuming logic. It's that simple. It's not that hard of an argument. Now, I'm not empirically demonstrated all those things that I'm assuming. But remember what almost 99% of these atheists all say: don't believe in anything unless it's empirically demonstrated, bro. Otherwise, it's superstition. Now, next, Feser moves on to consider areas where we will have to begin to critique him. And if you want to ask questions, we got one there. Feel free to leave super chat questions. Next, he calls the solution to this that neither the nominalist nor the mere conceptualist positions. And the conceptualist position was just that abstract objects are not physical; they only exist as mental states. But that doesn't really get you anywhere, because if everything is just mental states, then you're stuck in psychologism and solipsism. The end result of that is solipsism. So he says, so there's other versions of realism that we could give. There's Platonic Realism, Aristotelian Realism, and Scholastic Realism. Now, Feser is not aware of the fact that St. Maximus' view is not the view of Thomas Aquinas. And we will show that, we will demonstrate that here in a minute, because Feser deals with the objections, and he actually brings up the absolute divine simplicity objection that I'm going to bring up, and he doesn't rebut it. He just says, they're not really good objections. But he brings it up. But he doesn't say why it's a bad objection. It's a perfect objection. And we'll get to that in a minute. Anyway, so he calls the position Scholastic Realism. We'll call it St. Maximus Realism. Okay, because it shares some similarities with both Plato and with Aristotle. And Feser will admit that the Scholastic Realism position, he thinks, does that. But it's very crucial. This is why Maximus does not locate the universals or the exemplars in the essence of God, and the logi are not the same thing as the essences of creatures. It's very easy to prove that. Maximus says that universals can perish. Well, I'm sorry, but logi cannot perish, right? If the essences of created things were in the divine essence, they couldn't perish, right? But universals can perish, Maximus says. So there's a distinction between universals, they're created, and the logi, which are uncreated. The universals are patterned on the uncreated logi, and the logi are not the essence of God. So the first, he says, let's look at the solutions to nominalism, the different schools that we could go with. One school he says we could go with is Platonic Realism, and you heard me outline that at the beginning. We talked about the forms, Plato's conception of the forms, and we talked about how these aren't really good. They seem to give a little bit of an answer to the immediate problem of reducing the universals to the instantiations or to matter. It shows the problem there. But when we just say that there's another realm of these ideal things, we still got all these problems, right? How do we relate that unchanging realm to this realm? In what sense do they participate? How do we avoid the third man argument, et cetera, et cetera? There's a whole bunch of problems. The dualism problem of Platonism, right? Plato's ad hoc rescue of just saying, well, we know the forms because, like, we were reincarnated, bro. That's literally his ad hoc rescue for his whole metaphysic. We were in the realm of the forms once, and then we kind of fell into this one, and so we're remembering the forms from, the time when we were all in the monad. That's not a good answer. That's a terrible answer, actually. But that's the best thing Plato has. And Feser actually mentions some of my critiques of Platonism. Right? Not everybody knows of the third man critique. That's ancient. Even Plato brought it up. But there's other ones too, like the duality of the two realms. How do they actually relate? Plato's one in the many argument actually doesn't work, because if the many particular objects that we experience are different objects, then how do they have forms that are not really different? Because remember that the forms of objects have to have a higher level perfection in terms of their simplicity. So ultimately, they're all located in the monad. But the monad doesn't have real distinctions. Anytime you enter into the equation real distinctions, then you're moving into the lesser gradations of being, the lower rungs of the chain of being, because you're moving away from the one. So for Plato, the more distinct things are, the further down they are on the chain of being, down towards non-being. That's why we're all striving to get back to unity with the one. So once you have that metaphysical presupposition about the ontological supremacy of ultimate unity and simplicity, you have all these problems in your system. So manyness is on a lower status of being. And as you can imagine, when the church fathers encounter this, it takes centuries of debating, especially throughout the Cappadocians, to try to demonstrate the fact that the threeness of God is not somehow lesser than the unity of God. We'll come to that later when we look at Andreev and some of the quotes about love. But so basically, Feser just runs through some of the critiques and the problems with the Platonic response on realism. And one of the ones that he notes that's pretty good is a better objection would be to consider a universal concept like animality. Every individual animal is either rational, as human beings are, or non-rational, as other animals are. So what is animality itself, right? Precisely because it is a universal, it has to apply both to rational and non-rational animals, but it can't itself include both rationality and non-rationality, for these are contradictory properties, and thus the problem for saying that animality is located in a higher level reality of perfectionism in the forms. So we have to say that it inherently entails either rationality or non-rationality. No individual thing can be neither rational nor non-rational. And any existing thing has to be one or the other. Therefore, the universal concept of animality cannot be said to exist as an individual thing in its own right, as a self-subsisting form. And so it seems to not work on that system. Another problem that I just pointed out, Feser goes on to say, is that the things of our experience are not the forms themselves. So how do we even speak of a participation or a resemblance? Because remember, the characteristics, the properties of the form are completely different than the characteristics of the particulars in our experience. So in what sense is there any kind of real relation between these two? How do they resemble? It makes no sense. This is the same argument you hear me make about ADS. Same argument I make to the Muslims. It's the same point, because any system that has the presuppositions of absolute simplicity in this sense will have a hell of a time, an impossible task of trying to explain and locate the grounding of the particulars of this world in that thing. Doesn't work. And thus all ADS systems will collapse. That's also, of course, why Maximos does not say that the essences of creatures are identical to logi. The essences of creatures are in the creatures. He agrees with Aristotle on that. But the creatures and their instantiations, their particular, the logi of their being, their time coming to be, their existence, their providence, every molecule of their body is patterned on the logi, but not identical to the logi. Because the logi are in the divine mind. You're not identical to the divine mind, obviously. But many people make this mistake. They will identify the logi with the essences of created things. No, they're not. The essences of created things are in the objects. And he agrees with Aristotle there. But Maximus is also giving a nod to Plotinus by saying that the logi really are uncreated because they exist in the divine mind. And they come to be when God wills it. Therefore, they are thought wills about creatures. And so they are a different type of energy. They are a type of energy distinct from the eternal, what Palamas calls the natural energies. That doesn't mean that there's non-natural or unnatural energies. It's just a word that's used to signify the energies that would shine forth whether God created or not. And this comes from Athanasius' argument against the Arians. And that's why we distinguish God's love, glory, right? If he had not created, that would still be shining forth and reciprocated amongst the persons of the Trinity without a created order. This is why we're going to have to show, we're going to point out in a minute, that Losky, Staniloy, Andreev's argument, and St. Nikolai Belomorovich makes this argument too, that you can actually show that the Trinity is the only logical, rational deity that avoids a necessary creation. Because if he's God, if he's Lord, who is he Lord and God in relationship to? Unless there's an eternal, is he eternal Lord, eternal God? If he's a single hypostasis, a single God, then he must be Lord God over an eternal creation. Unless he's triune, and there's an eternal reciprocation of love and attributes like glory shining forth amongst the triad, regardless of a created order, right? But then when he creates on the basis of will, not on the basis of any necessary pattern in his essence, but only on the basis of will. And yes, he did create on the basis of patterns, you could say, in the divine mind that are called the logi, but he didn't have to bring them to be. He willed to bring them to be. That's why this view is different. But that's precisely where we're going to critique Feser, because Feser is not aware of Maximus. He doesn't appear to have any knowledge of Maximus at all. He thinks that really there's just Augustine and Aquinas, and that sums up the whole exemplar doctrine. No, it doesn't. Next, he moves to Aristotelian Realism. And as you can imagine, Aristotle believes that animality, triangularity, redness, humanness are not in a third realm. They are located in the objects, so to speak, of experience. The mind abstracts from these particular instances of the objects. In terms of the phantasm, it's able to, in the mind. So basically the exterior objects, in Aristotle's view, imprint upon our mind through the senses, these different instances, right? And then the mind, through that phantasm, is able to abstract the universal. So we get a concept of the universal, right, that is present, so to speak, in the objects. The essence of the objects is in those objects. Of course, there's other problems with this view, which I've outlined in other papers and essays, which is that Aristotle seems to have this notion that objects are reducible to the essence of that object. And so therefore there's not really multiple universals or levels of participation in specific objects. But if that's the case, then they don't really possess different types of realities. And that becomes problematic when we start talking about Christology, when we talk about anthropology in the Orthodox conception. And that's why there's a nod given to both Plato, Aristotle, Plotinus in our tradition. Maximus will make free use of these different systems when they're right and reject them when they're wrong. Let's look at now the divine conceptualism argument that Feser moves to, that you hear me make often, and I'm going to tweak it because I don't think Feser, he's on the right track here, but he doesn't really take it to the right place because he's still situating all this within, quote, natural theology. For Feser, this proves any kind of God, right? Oh, it's going to prove a generic God that has omniscience. Oh, so Judaism, Islam, what good of an argument is that? But we will give some props because he will mention the fact that the divine conceptual argument that he locates first in St. Augustine, he says that Augustine made the argument that universals, propositions, mathematical and logical truths, necessary and possible worlds, etc., necessary and possible states of affairs, can only be logically grounded in an intellect or a divine mind that is infinite and eternal. Thus, some form of realism has to be true, but the Platonic realism and the Aristotelian realism are severely deficient, and thus all we're left with is some form of a realism in which there's divine conceptualism. And basically what that means is that we're grounding we're locating and grounding the universals, etc., in the mind of God. But now remember, and he will mention this objection at the end of this chapter, What is the Roman Catholic doctrine of divine ideas in terms of Aquinas? Now, maybe a Scotus could get around this. I don't really think so, but because I mean, John Duns Scotus in his treatise on unicity of God, he says all the same stuff about simplicity in terms of knowledge, will, and act that Aquinas says. He equates them all with the essence of God in a strict identity, even though he also says that there's a formal distinction. Whatever. I don't think that position avoids the problem, because I think Scotus is drawing quite a bit from Augustine when it comes to some of these ideas. And if that's the case, then you're still going to have the problem of locating the archetypes in the essence of God. In other words, even if you say that the divine ideas are formally distinct, which I'm not sure if Scotus says that, maybe he does, but it doesn't avoid the problem of saying that, but they're really ultimately identical to the essence of God. Either way, it doesn't matter, because it's not Maximos's position, which is the correct position, which is that they are thought wills. I did want to mention too, even Augustine's argument is lacking, because when Augustine makes this point, again, what is this kind of God? I mean, we don't believe that God is just a singular divine mind, okay? That's absolutely simple and contained all these universals. That's not our view. That's like a Neoplatonic view. But that doesn't work, because our God is the triune God who created the world, right? I mean, you could hold that view and hold to emanationism as Neoplatonists. So what distinguishes this view from Neoplatonism? Well, then you have to start injecting things like, well, this God's personal. Ah, yes. Now, if this God's personal, how do we know that it's not still just a singular personal God? That's where you have to bring in Trinity. Not just because of the one and many argument and grounding the one and the many in equal ultimacy in God in terms of the Trinity and the Logi, but also in the sense of what we said earlier about necessary and freely willed creation, right? The single God, right? If we have the Aristotelian or any sort of monotheistic concept, the strict monotheism in the sense of just one hypostasis, the problem with that position, again, is that, and pretty much, maybe not every case, but a lot of the philosophers and theologians who've held that position, whether Muslim, Jewish, or whatever, they oftentimes will accept the Aristotelian argumentation about eternal matter and eternal creation. Well, that's not our view. We believe in ex nihilo, right? So that's not the same God as we believe, right? And you say, well, but so what? Well, Basil specifically says Aristotle is an idiot and a blasphemer for saying that. I'm going to show you that. So what we start to realize is that you can't divorce your argumentation of God from what's revealed about God and posit a God who is a great architect working with eternal matter. That's Masonry. That's not our view. So you have to have the whole Christian paradigm. That's what we're arguing for. We're not arguing for Aristotle's great architect of the universe God. An architect works with existing matter. He doesn't create ex nihilo. Oh, well, we'll just tack that on later down the road as Thomists or whatever. No, that doesn't work, because those are no good arguments. So we have to argue for the paradigm as a whole, because guess what? None of the concepts that we're using here, universals, mind of God, laws of logic, existence, divine intellect, all of these terms that we're using are situated and explained within the paradigm. None of those terms are neutral. The laws of logic aren't neutral. They only make sense and are coherent within the paradigm as a whole. That's, of course, what Feser does not get as a Thomist. So as we see, even if we prove a divine mind or whatever, it's still not a very good argument, because any Muslim, any Jew could make that same argument and could argue that the created world is eternal. Now, Basil laughs at that and says that is destructive to your whole argument for monotheism, because now you've given the attribute of eternality and uncreated to matter. But your whole argument was that God alone is God. But if God alone is God, and he's got to be God and Lord over someone or something, then it seems to necessitate an eternal matter or creation that he's God over. Well, now you've made the created world, prima materia, the first heavens, whatever, matter, eternal. Now Basil says, he laughs and he says, now you're an idiot because you have made in your quest to be a strict monotheist, you've now had to admit that matter takes on a divine property and has to be another hypostasis. So what, you've got eternal God and eternal matter? That's dualism. We all know that there's serious problems for dualism. And if you have that dualist system, then dualism can easily fall into the opposite of itself, because now you've got two eternal principles that necessitate one another. And as you know, from pretty much every dualist system that's ever existed, this tends to lead to the conclusion that they're in tension. Do we need to flee to the first cause, or are we stuck in the realm of matter and flux? You see. So dualist systems are incoherent, they're stupid, they don't work, and the strict monotheistic position, which was intended to avoid polytheism and dualism, ends up falling right into it when you ask about the doctrine of creation. Aristotle himself makes this argument. He says the first mover to be pure act has to be eternally moving something, or else it makes no sense. So he says it has to be the first heavens, an eternal substance or matter that he's eternally moved. So there's no creation doctrine. So that's not our God. That's Masonry. Did you know Masonry teaches the great architect of the universe? Oh, but look. So imagine using a bunch of Masonic arguments. Like, as a Christian, let's borrow all the Masonic arguments. To argue for what? Thought thinking itself? Come on. Now, back to the good point that Feser was making about the universal concepts, about the Augustinian argument, and then he moves to a good argument that Leibniz makes about the eternality of truth. He says that the basic thrust of this argument is that Leibniz, borrowing from Augustine, made the argument that truth itself it seems to suggest eternality, right? So if Caesar, was crossed the Rubicon, whatever year that was, and even though it's in the past, it's forever true, right, that Caesar crossed the Rubicon. So the trueness of it, the event, even if it was temporal, at least from this point on, is eternal. And it doesn't matter whether that was, whether there's a possible world where Caesar didn't have to do that. It doesn't matter, because that did happen. We believe that happened in some sense. Therefore, the trueness of it is, in a sense, eternal. It will never be the case that Caesar crossed the Rubicon and did not cross the Rubicon. Right? That's impossible. So it will eternally be true that Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Now, if that's the case, then the truthfulness of events or propositions or whatever cannot be identified in the material events themselves. Obviously. These are pretty simple arguments if you think about them. They do not, the propositions and their truths, arguments, he says, do not depend on the material world. Triangularity and redness, etc., however, are universal, and therefore nominalism and conceptualism are false and do not work. The Platonic realist solution doesn't work. The Aristotelian realist solution doesn't work. And so really the only option here is to not ground abstract objects only in the human mind. The human mind is changing. It's in flux. It's not, it comes and goes in time and space. And as we pointed out from Aristotle, you can't, from Leibniz there, you can't reduce universals or the trueness of universals to the instantiations of the human mind. So the only other option really is to have a divine mind. By the way, he also points out that this makes sense too. Because even if you collected all the human minds, that still doesn't give you the universal, you see. Where's the universal? How do you locate it? There's also a universal for every particular. That's Leibniz's point. So if that's the case, then the ultimate ground has to lie beyond individual finite human minds. The only other possibility, given the fact that the universals and the particulars are an interlocking system. Did you hear that? That's the argument I make all the time. They relate to one another. They interlock. Given the fact that they interlock, no finite mind can hold these together. You can't ground them in any finite mind. He says even angels, if you were trying, oh, well, maybe we can ground these in the minds of angels. It doesn't work because they're still finite, right? Now, these logical relationships, he says, would hold whether or not this natural world existed, whether or not there was even any finite mind. So there must be a necessarily existing divine intellect, which grasps all the logical relationships, all the propositions, all the possibilities, and thus even the infinite number of mathematical propositions. And thus, if this is infinite, then you need an omniscient mind. There's no other options. The ultimate ground of existence of the abstract objects would thus have to be the divine mind. There's no other options. Right? Well, why does this mind have to be omniscient? Now, he goes into pointing out that it gives some arguments about actus purus as to why this mind has to be omniscient, that's somehow higher level perfection or something, that if God has potentia, then somehow he's less perfect. Well, then he didn't create freely, right? Because we all believe that God could or could not create the world, right? And if he freely created, or if we just make the simple argument that God had the potential to create the world in a different way, or is it logically possible that God created a world where there was no God, where there was no Pope or Aquinas? If those are logically possible, and if I can reverse this argument and say on the basis of God is pure potentiality God is pure actuality with no potentia, then all the potentia must also be actualized, right? You can reverse this argument either way. Then if all the potentia are actualized, and there are all of the worlds that are possible, logically possible, then there's a world where there's no Aquinas and no Pope, and so therefore the papacy is not necessary. By the way, show me how that's a false argument on these grounds. You can't. All right, because again, listen to what I'm saying. So if God is pure act, right, with no potentia, I can take that argument in two different routes. I can go with the typical ADS critique and say, then creation was not freely done. God didn't have the potential to create or not create, right? There was no dunamis distinct from energeia. Does God have the power to create a world? Of course he does. Did he have to create it? No, he freely created it. So then God is not excluded from all potentia. He does not have to actualize all the potentia. But if he's pure act with no potentia, then any potential possibility has to be actualized, right? I can cut the argument either way. And if that's the case, is it logically possible that God can create a world where there's no Aquinas and no Pope? Yes. Then Aquinas and the Pope are not logically necessary. And the Roman Catholic system doesn't work. Anyway, divine conceptualism, he tries to bring in absolute divine simplicity and actus purus, but there's a big problem with this. That's going to be the last point here. We're going to make sure that I'm not going too close. By the way, in a few minutes here, yes, please put the Discord link because we're going to have Metropolitan Jonah giving catechism classes in about 20 minutes in the Discord. So I'll be getting off here, and then we can do the rest of this in the part 2 of the talk. Maybe I'll have to extend this into other talks because I didn't really even I only got halfway into Feser's chapter here. I didn't even get to Basil and Aristotle and Andreev, and I want to get to the sections of Aristotle that are relevant for this. But Feser makes one of my critiques against Platonism that no, that we already covered that earlier. What does it mean to say that this world represents the forms? He's already said that. But I don't have time to do it. So Father Deacon will be there's the Discord link if anybody wants to join the Discord and You can hear the Metropolitan Jonah's lectures. But let's see if we can get through this argument from Feser on divine conceptualism, and we'll follow this through. So he gives a series of steps, and he says there are three possible accounts of the abstract objects, such as universals, propositions, numbers, and other mathematical objects, and possible worlds: realism, nominalism, conceptualism. There are decisive arguments in favor of realism. There are insuperable arguments against nominalism, and there are insuperable arguments against conceptualism. So some version of realism must be true. Correct, I would agree with that. There are three possible versions of realism: Platonic realism, Aristotelian realism, and what he calls scholastic realism, which we are going to modify to say the realism of St. Maximus. If Platonic realism is true, then abstract objects exist in a third realm distinct from either the material world or any individual human intellect. If Aristotelian realism is true, then abstract objects exist only in the human or in other contingently existing intellects. If scholastic, or squish that, if St. Maximus's realism is true, then abstract objects exist not only in contingently existing intellects, but also in at least one necessarily existing intellect, namely the divine mind. There are insuperable objections against the claim that abstract objects exist in a Platonic third realm, distinct from either the material world or the intellect. Therefore, Platonic realism is not true. Correct. Yeah, we just covered all that in the earlier part of the chapter. There are insuperable objects against the claim that abstract objects exist only in the human mind or in other contingently existing intellects. We covered that earlier. Therefore, Aristotelian realism is not true. So the last option here is a form of what he calls scholastic, St. Maximus's realism. So abstract objects exist not only in contingently existing intellects, but also in at least one necessarily existing intellect. Next, abstract objects such as universals, propositions, numbers, and other mathematical objects, and possible worlds are all logically related to one another in an interlocking way such that they form a system of ideas. Yes, interlocking. The reasons for concluding that at least some abstract objects exist in a necessarily existing intellect also entail that this interlocking system of ideas must exist in a necessarily existing intellect, the divine mind. Yes, we've argued that earlier. So this interlocking system of ideas exists in at least one necessarily existing intellect. This is where it becomes a problem. 19. A necessarily existing intellect has to be purely actual. No, it doesn't. I just gave you the argument as to why that's impossible and it doesn't work. And he will even mention this argument and not answer it. So there cannot be more than one necessarily existing intellect. We would agree with that. An intellect in which the interlocking system of ideas in question existed would be conceptually omniscient. Correct, we do agree with that. And by the way, it has to be the triad. And that's what we're going to argue as we move on. Now, he moves on to some more points that kind of we would agree with in a sense, but he basically just concludes this by saying, therefore, God exists, right? The omniscient. But the problem is that what God are we talking about? We have not distinguished this generic theism of a sort from any other generic monotheism. But we do not argue for generic monotheism. We argue for the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who eternally generates the Son and eternally spirates the Spirit. That's the only God there is. And if we say that he is a bare monotheism, guess what? Aristotle is the more consistent monotheist. What does Aristotle say in Book 12 of the Metaphysics? Aristotle says in Book 12 that he gives his definition of actus purus, an absolute simplicity, in Book 12, chapters 5, 6, 7. I'm trying to hurry so we can get to Metropolitan Jonah, but you'll notice that it's right here. It's very clear. If you want to go read these, you can. 5, 6, 7. He will speak of eternal matter, eternal movement, eternal substance, that the first cause, the unmoved mover, moves the first heaven eternally as his first substance. He's eternal substance, eternal matter. Basil, as we said, makes fun of this. He says, you're a tard. If you think this is in Hexameron, Homily 2, at the very beginning. And he will make fun of the great architect deity. And he's referring to this section of Aristotle. So props to Father Deacon Ananias for finding, because the notes in the shaft set are wrong, or some other numbering system, so it took forever to find this, but it's in book 12, 5, 6, and 7. Aristotle's more consistent, because if the eternal first mover is an eternal first mover, for that to mean anything coherent, he has to eternally move something. If God is the eternal creator, then he eternally creates, or has a creation that's eternal, which he's got over. These arguments are dumb. Therefore, you can't hold to a bare monotheism and have the words and predicates and names of him mean anything without an eternal creation for him to be God and Lord over. So it's a very simple argument, and when we get to part 2, we'll look at how Andreev responds to this, how Lossky and Staniloy respond to this, by pointing out that this obviously shows that the Trinity is the only God who really solves this. There's no other options, right? There's no, the dualism argument doesn't work. St. Maximus will refute that, the dualism God. The only one you're left with is the Trinity. Okay, so it's not that difficult here. But I'll close the part with Feser by pointing out, listen to what Feser says here with his objection, the objections to realism and the problem in his Thomist system. William Wainwright suggests, based on Grimm's objection, there also seems to be an assumption of a model of divine knowledge which would be rejected by those that hold to God as absolutely simple or a non-composite being. In particular, it seems to assume that the view that Feser is arguing for, it seems to assume that truths that God knows correspond to discrete ideas in the divine intellect. Well, yeah, if the things in the world are grounded in the divine mind, in the Roman Catholic divine ideas argument, then if the things in the world are really distinct, then they got to be based on ideas that are really distinct. But then you turn around and you say that the divine ideas are absolutely identical to the essence of God. And they're not really distinct, they're only virtually and nominally distinct. Yeah, it's a great argument. In particular, it seems to, he says that in the divine intellect, we could say that these are a set. But given the divine simplicity, what we describe in terms of such discrete ideas is really one and the same thing in God. Thank you for admitting that, Feser. There is in God something analogous to what we call our own intellects, so analogia, and thus we grasp a proposition, for example, all men are mortal. We grasp something analogous to what we call a grasp of the proposition that Socrates is a man, and so forth. So these propositions, they're analogous to something in the divine mind, but these are just different ways of describing what in God is really one and the same thing. Exactly. So how does that work? Guess what? Feser doesn't address it. He just goes on. So the very thing that I would go to, the very argument, Feser doesn't even reply to it. He just says, yeah, well, it's different in God. Okay, but that's not an answer. And so he says, these objections are not powerful. Right? The next page, this is the final page. He doesn't address that argument. He just says that it's not, it's just different in the divine intellect. But that's the very thing that's in question. So, Feser, how do you avoid the critique that you gave of Plato? Because you critiqued Platonic realism by saying that the descriptors of what's in the form, in the monad, are totally different than the descriptors of the things in this realm that are supposed to be analogous to or resemble it. You got the same problem, dude, when it comes to Aquinas. And you just pass over that argument. You don't even address it. Maybe he'll address it. I hope so, right? Anyway, in part 2, we'll get to how the triad is necessitated and solves these dilemmas via the exchange of love in the Trinity. And this comes from St. Nikolai Velimirovich, Father Staniloy, Vladimir Lossky, and Andreev, the Russian apologist Andreev. Thank you, guys. Let's get to these super chats really quick before we go to Metropolitan Jonah. Let me find the first... Try to find the first one. Where is it at? All right. Tukin, is that Tolkien? Tukin donates $2. He says, how do you square Christianity with technology and where is it heading? I would say go watch Father Deacon Dr. Ananias' talk on technology in Christianity. He did a whole really good long lecture on that, so I would recommend that. Go to his channel over at Norwegian News and you'll find that talk. Are emotions universal? Nick says for $5. Yeah, in a sense, right? So when we talk about the ontological status of emotions and the propositions about emotions, those are all universal truth claims. They are all they describe universal states of affairs and so forth. All human beings possess emotions in some sense and degree, unless they're vegetables or something. I don't know. But so in those senses, emotions are universal. And yes, we can speak of them in that sense. Jordan donates $10. Thank you, Jordan. And Fonz donates $5. Thank you, Fonz. And if you want to, of course, the subscription to the site is in the show description. You can subscribe to the website, and we'll get into more depth in the second half of this when we have more time. And we'll look at more Feser. We'll look at the other Trinitarian points. And we'll look at some of the arguments about logia as well that help explicate this and why we don't believe the Neoplatonic view and how St. Maximus is really correcting our view from the Neoplatonic view. And then we'll look at where in Aristotle he talks about eternal matter and all that stuff and what he's talking about. Yeah, I mean, if you know, they're not, these arguments might sound obtuse, but if you start to understand what we're saying, they're not that bad. They're not that hard. So Metropolitan Jonah will be doing a catechism lecture, I guess 3 or 4. I'm not sure where we are. I was off getting married, so I'm a little late to the game here. But go to the Discord, and then we'll have that link set up for that. If you want the second part of this talk in the next few days, subscribe at JaysAnalysis at the membership links in the show description. And anyway, hopefully this was interesting. God bless everybody. Have a good night.